My parents knew my husband was cheating on me with my sister and helped him hide it. At Mom's birthday dinner, they told me to be matured and accept it. The next morning, my lawyers served my husband the divorce papers and a termination letter from my company. Let me tell you how everything happened. If you are new here and you enjoy stories like this one, kindly subscribe to this channel and feel free to let us know where you are listening to us from. Now let's get into the details of the story. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked through the door, and no one turned to greet me. The living room was lit too brightly, too deliberately, like it was trying to cover up a bruise. My mother stood near the table in her coral dress, the one she reserved for Easter or guilt. She smiled like it hurt, her lips barely curving around her teeth. My father adjusted the Bluetooth speaker in the corner, muttering about the playlist, though the silence between songs felt louder than any music could. And there they were, my husband and my sister, standing far too close at the kitchen island, laughing about something only they could hear. It was Mom's 61st birthday. She had insisted we all be there. As a family, she said, despite my vague protests about deadlines and headaches. Now I understood. She hadn't wanted to celebrate. She'd wanted witnesses. I set down the wine bottle I brought, even though I knew no one would drink it but me. My sister gave me a quick, too bright hug that left the scent of her vanilla perfume clinging to my coat. My husband barely looked up from his phone. I watched his thumb slide across the screen, and for a split second he looked nervous. It passed. He looked up, smiled that familiar, absent smile and said, "You made it." The table was already set. My mother had laid out the good plates, the ones she never used, not even on Thanksgiving. I took my seat, and across from me, my husband reached for the bread basket, brushing against my sister's hand. She didn't flinch. Dinner passed like a play performed by tired actors. There was talk of weather and local elections, Dad's usual complaint about property taxes. I answered questions about work I no longer loved, and my sister offered updates on her latest freelance projects, which as always remained suspiciously vague. My husband nodded along, chiming in only when someone else was speaking, laughing a beat too long. I watched them like you watch people in a dream, knowing something was off, but unable to name it. Then dessert came. Mom's cake was chocolate with raspberry filling, her favorite. She waited until the plates were passed, and the candles blown out. That's when she folded her hands and looked at me, the way she used to when I was a child, and had done something wrong in public. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending," she said, cutting through the air like she was slicing another layer of cake. "It's been going on for a while now, and you need to be mature about it." I didn't respond. I didn't move. I couldn't, not yet. My body had gone rigid, the way it did when I was 6 and fell into the deep end of the neighbor's pool, and no one noticed right away. I stared at her, then at my husband, who looked down at his fork as if it held the answer. My sister took a slow sip of wine. My father reached for a napkin and pretended to clean his glasses. "You knew?" I asked, but it didn't come out as a question. It came out like something I'd scraped from the back of my throat. Mom sighed, already exhausted by my reaction. "You deserve to be with someone who makes you happy, honey." And clearly that wasn't happening. "You've been so cold to him lately." The room blurred at the edges. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something quieter. A low-frequency hum of betrayal that vibrated in my bones. They didn't just know. They condoned it, shielded it, and now they were asking me to bless it. I pushed my chair back slowly, careful not to let it scrape. My hands were steady, but only because they were completely numb. I looked each of them in the eyes, my sister's lined in perfect eyeliner, my mother's glinting with forced conviction, my husband's pretending to be ashamed but not nearly enough. "You don't get to tell me what I deserve," I said, voice level but cracking just once, right at the end. No one followed me out. No one called my name. Outside, the air was cold and damp. The sky hung low, swollen with the threat of rain. I walked to my car, sat behind the wheel, and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel for a long time. The keys trembled in my hand. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale, unfamiliar. I didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later in private. At home I didn't pack. I didn't drink. I sat down at the kitchen counter, opened my laptop and sent 2 emails, one to my attorney and one to the head of HR. Both were short, emotionless. Precise. I attached the files I'd prepared weeks ago, before I ever had proof, but when my gut had already started speaking to me in broken sentences and pitiful dreams. I didn't sleep that night. But I didn't fall apart either. I waited. I waited for morning, when he'd open the door to a courier holding 2 envelopes. I waited for him to understand what it felt like to be chosen last by the person you loved most. I waited for the silence he left behind to become something I could live with. The hours between that dinner and dawn dragged like wet clothing. Everything I touched felt too heavy. My coffee mug, my skin. The air in the hallway that seemed to thicken just to resist me. I moved around my apartment like it belonged to someone else, brushing past framed photos and shelves lined with books we bought together. I caught myself reaching for my phone to text him about something on TV before remembering, with a jolt, that we were no longer speaking in the language of we. By 3:17 a.m., I had counted every crack in the ceiling and stared at my bedroom door long enough to memorize its grain. I watched shadows stretch and recede on the walls, tricking myself into thinking they moved with intention. I knew sleep wasn't coming. My body was alert, like it expected an emergency at any moment. And maybe it was still waiting for someone to knock on the door and say, "We were wrong. Come back." But they didn't. They never would. So I made coffee even though it made my stomach churn. I sat at the kitchen table, wearing the hoodie I'd stolen from him in college, a soft, worn gray thing that still carried the faintest trace of his cologne. I should have thrown it out. Instead, I clung to it like it could explain something. At 8:12 a.m., I heard the text tone I'd set just for my lawyer. On my way with the courier. "You okay?" I didn't answer. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I didn't know what okay meant anymore. The plan was simple. The courier would hand him 2 envelopes, one with the finalized divorce papers filed and notarized, no longer a threat but a certainty. The other, stamped with my company's letterhead, would be his termination letter. I was the co-founder, technically still his superior. I drafted the letter weeks ago, and reviewed it enough times to feel nothing when I saw his name typed above, effective immediately. At 9:04 a.m., I parked across from our office building and watched him arrive. He looked the same. Casual blazer, dark jeans. The confidence of a man who'd convinced himself he'd gotten away with it. He didn't notice the courier waiting near the door until she stepped in front of him. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw the moment recognition dawned on his face, followed by confusion. Then fear. Then anger. I expected him to throw something, to rip the envelopes in half. Instead, he just stood there, reading slowly, mouth parting as if he might call someone to explain it all away. He didn't. I stayed in my car watching, and for the first time in months, I felt something that bordered on satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed his pain, though a cruel part of me might have, but because I knew he finally understood the gravity of what he'd done. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't begging. I wasn't even crying. I had simply removed myself from the table he'd been feasting at behind my back. By noon, the news had circulated through the company. A few coworkers messaged me cautiously, not asking for details but offering quiet support. "We're here if you need anything," one wrote. It was the kind of message people send when they don't know what to say but want to be kind. I clung to it like a lifeline. That afternoon, I walked through the park near our old apartment. I used to come here when things got hard. Deadlines, fights. That miscarriage we never told anyone about. The trees were bare now, branches clawing at the sky like they wanted to take it down with them. I sat on a bench and tried to feel the wind. Tried to be present in a body that still felt like a stranger's. I thought of all the things I'd ignored. The missed calls from my sister that I chalked up to her being extra close. The way he started changing his phone password more often. The new cologne. The one time I walked in on them laughing in the kitchen and felt like I'd interrupted something sacred. I let myself grieve, not for the marriage, not even for the betrayal, but for the version of me who still believed in the safety of family. When I got home, I checked the locks 3 times. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I finally understood that safety would have to be something I built from scratch. I showered with the lights off, letting the water scald my shoulders, trying to wash off the memory of being touched by someone who never really saw me. I stared at my reflection in the steamed mirror, traced the outline of my face with my finger, and whispered, "You're still here." Not strong, not healed, just still here. And for now that had to be enough. It started with the wine glass. I had just taken it down from the top shelf, the last clean one in the kitchen. It had a fine dust on the rim from months of neglect, maybe even longer. I rinsed it, poured a cheap red from a bottle I didn't remember buying, and sat at the counter with every intention of drinking like a normal person. But then I saw it, his handwriting on a grocery list shoved behind the blender. Almond milk. Greek yogurt. My name scribbled in parentheses like a joke. I didn't scream. I didn't wail. I just stared at that slip of paper, breathing in slow, shallow gasps like I was trying to survive a fire one lungful at a time. And then the glass slipped from my hand. Not accidentally, not really. It spun once on the edge of the marble, and then shattered against the floor in 100 vicious pieces. It sounded like a scream should, like a truth that couldn't be swallowed anymore. That's when the rage bloomed. Not the hot, all-consuming kind. This was colder. Precise. A glacier cracking open underfoot. It didn't burn, it numbed. I stepped over the broken glass without shoes. I wanted to feel something sharp. I didn't. I walked to the bedroom, peeled back the layers of our old life with calculated detachment. His side of the closet was mostly empty. He had taken what he wanted weeks ago, probably while I was still at work pretending we had a future. But there were pieces he'd left behind, cufflinks from our wedding day, an old hoodie he wore when he was sick, a box of letters we never mailed to each other when we were long distance and still believed in fate. I dumped them into a trash bag and tied it shut, tighter than necessary. The ache that followed wasn't physical. It was memory. I remembered our first apartment, how we'd lived off takeout and laughed at the moldy windowsill. How he used to leave post-it notes on my laptop with stupid jokes just to make me smile. I remembered his hand in mine the day I told him about the pregnancy. The miscarriage. How he held me until I fell asleep, whispered, "We'll try again." And I believed him. I remembered how my sister had been there too. She brought soup, held my hand when I woke up crying. I thought she was grieving with me. Now I wondered if she had been grieving what she couldn't have. Yet. I walked back to the kitchen barefoot, felt a sliver of glass pierce the ball of my foot. I welcomed the sting, pressed down harder. In the bathroom, I pulled it out with tweezers, watched the blood bead up like it had something to prove. The mirror above the sink was cracked slightly in the corner, a flaw I'd always meant to fix. I looked at myself, really looked, and realized I had no idea who I was without him, without the script we'd written together. I wasn't the victim, not exactly. I was something worse. The fool who saw all the signs and begged them not to be real. I'd always believed in the strength of keeping peace. I didn't yell. I didn't push. I negotiated with silence, bartered with my own dignity. I thought that was what it meant to love someone, sacrificing comfort for harmony. But that night, alone and bleeding just a little, I felt something shift. The edge of my sorrow curled inward, and I found a new emotion hiding underneath. Fury. Didn't feel good. Felt honest. I opened my laptop again, not for emails this time. I started a document, titled it Things I Saw Too Late. I typed without stopping, every moment I'd rationalized. The shared glances, the sudden change in his cologne, the time my sister borrowed my earrings and never gave them back. Each memory was a bead on a rosary of humiliation. I recited them until they lost their power. I wrote, "He made a fool of me and they helped him do it. And I let them. But not anymore." When I was done, the sun was coming up. A dull light filtered through the blinds, softening the wreckage of my kitchen. I didn't clean the broken glass yet. I needed it there. Needed a reminder that something had been destroyed, and that I had survived the sound of it breaking. Not healed, not whole, but burning now. And sometimes fire was cleaner than forgiveness. The message came just before noon, nestled between spam promotions and a notification from the electric company. A group text from my mother, titled Family. I opened it without thinking, still in the fog of a day I hadn't yet started. There it was, staring back at me. A photo from the night of the birthday dinner. We were all there, my mother at the head of the table, her smile wide and lacquered with approval, my father mid-toast, eyes soft with wine and willful ignorance, my sister leaning into my husband, her hand just barely grazing his under the table, and me in the far corner, smiling with my teeth but not my eyes. A ghost among the living. The caption read, "A night to remember. Thank you all for being there." I stared at it so long my phone dimmed from inactivity. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't think of a single word that didn't taste like blood. I never responded. Instead, I zoomed in on my own face, the only one not fully looking at the camera. I looked distracted, half present, like I already knew what was coming and just hadn't figured out how to stop it. I remembered that moment. The waiter had just set down the cake, and I'd noticed my husband's hand resting on the back of my sister's chair. Light, almost protective. I blinked it away. That photo lived in my head for the rest of the day. I didn't cry. I did something worse. I remembered being 13 and watching my mother wipe mascara from my sister's cheeks, telling her, "You have to understand how people see you. You're beautiful. That's power." I remembered standing in the hallway, still in my muddy soccer cleats, wondering if anyone would ever say something like that to me. They didn't. I remembered the time my sister got a speeding ticket, and I took the blame, because she was dating someone Dad disapproved of, and I didn't want to ruin her chance. I remembered the Christmas when Mom gave her diamond earrings and handed me a cardigan 3 sizes too big. I wore it anyway. I always wore what they gave me. That was the worst part of betrayal, I think, the way it retroactively poisons every moment of grace. I started looking through old photos obsessively, like a detective returning to a cold case. There they were. My husband and sister beside each other at every holiday dinner, every family vacation. Small touches. Shared jokes. The way she looked at him, a beat longer than necessary. I found one from 2 years ago. Her head resting lightly on his shoulder while I stood in the background, cut off by the frame. A smile frozen mid-laugh, unaware. I didn't know who to blame more, them or myself, because I saw it. I did. Somewhere in my gut, I knew something didn't fit. But I was raised to keep the peace, to stay pleasant, to swallow anything that might make people uncomfortable. My silence wasn't innocence, it was complicity. That night I deleted every photo of them from my phone. Not out of anger. Out of necessity. I needed to reclaim the narrative, to unbraid their faces from my memories. I opened a blank folder on my desktop and named it Evidence I Won't Forget. I filled it with the things I couldn't say out loud. Screenshots of texts, receipts, timestamps. Not for revenge. For sanity. Because when people lie to you that completely, when they weaponize your trust and call it love, you start questioning your own grip on reality. I needed proof that I hadn't imagined it all. That I hadn't made it up just to give myself a reason to leave. I kept the group photo. Just one copy tucked away in a hidden album, titled Final Supper. Because that's what it was. The last time I sat at a table thinking I belonged. I didn't speak to my parents for the rest of that week. They called. Left voicemails. One from my mother, unusually soft. "You need to understand, sweetheart. Love is complicated." I almost laughed. As if love was what I'd been watching unfold in stolen glances and whispered lies. That night, I cooked dinner for one. Something simple, soup from a can, bread toasted too dark. I ate it at the counter in silence. The same silence that used to fill our house after arguments I wasn't allowed to win. I felt the shape of it all settling into place. Who they were, who I had been, and what I would never let them make of me again. They wanted me to accept it. To be mature. But maturity, I was learning, wasn't silence. It was clarity. It was walking away from people who built their joy on your erasure. It was letting the house burn, if that's what it took to find your way out. And I was already holding the match. He called 3 times. The first came that morning, less than 24 hours after he'd been served. I watched the screen light up from across the room. His name still programmed under a nickname I'd given him back in college, J. Just the letter. Back then, I thought it sounded mysterious. Now it felt like a placeholder for someone who never fully arrived. I didn't answer. The second call came while I was brushing my teeth, foam collecting at the corners of my mouth, as I watched the screen flash again. Voicemail this time. He said my name like it still belonged to him, soft and low, like he was soothing a wound that hadn't been his to inflict. "Can we talk? I didn't want it to happen this way. Just call me back. Please." I played it twice, not because I missed him, but because I wanted to remember the exact cadence of his voice when he realized I wasn't bluffing. The third call came the next day. I picked up. "Hi," I said, flat and tired. There was silence on the line, hesitation, breath, and then his voice suddenly small. "You really went through with it?" "Yes." A pause. The termination letter. You don't work there anymore. He laughed, bitter and disbelieving, like he hadn't read the fine print of our unraveling. You really think this fixes anything? No, I said. But it ends it. I don't remember most of what he said after that. Something about how I'd always been too cold, too focused on my career. How my family had always liked him better. That last part almost made me laugh. He threw my sister's name in once, by accident I think, and then tried to backpedal. But the damage was done. He had let her name slip the same way you let someone's name slip when they're no longer a secret. I trusted you, I said quietly. More than I trusted myself. He didn't answer. I made you my home, I continued. And you turned it into a hiding place for all the things I didn't want to see. Still nothing. Just his breath, uneven and too close to the receiver. I ended the call. Afterward, I sat on the edge of the couch and felt the emptiness settle around me like fog. There was no triumph in it.
No catarsis.
Just the hollow relief of a truth spoken aloud finally. I didn't feel strong. I felt scraped clean. Like someone had taken a blade to my insides and left everything raw and exposed. But that was the thing about survival. It didn't always look like strength. Sometimes it just looked like continuing. Later that week, I went to the office to sign the final HR paperwork. Everyone was polite but careful around me, as if I carried some contagious grief. My assistant left a cup of tea on my desk without saying a word. Someone had watered my plants. Small mercies, quiet kindnesses, they meant more than they should have. My business partner, Lena, closed the door behind her and sat across from me, legs crossed, eyes kind but unflinching. You okay? She asked. No, I said. But I'm awake. She nodded. That's a start. We reviewed the termination documents one more time. He'd tried to contest it, of course. But I had prepared meticulously. Every misuse of company funds, every conflict of interest, every instance of negligence. It was all documented. I hadn't even needed to mention the affair. This was about business. Clean. Final. Before she left, Lena reached into her coat pocket and handed me something wrapped in tissue paper. You left this in the conference room once. I kept forgetting to give it back. It was a lapel pin I'd worn to our launch event 2 years ago. Tiny silver, shaped like a flame. I held it in my palm for a long time after she left. It reminded me of who I'd been before the unraveling. Fierce. Focused. Willing to build something from the ground up. I went home and pinned it to my coat, not because I felt ready to start over, but because I wanted to remember that I could. I didn't plan to disappear. Not exactly. But I packed a duffel bag one morning without folding anything, tossed it in the backseat of my car, and started driving with no destination in mind. I left my phone on Do Not Disturb and didn't tell anyone where I was going. I told myself it was just a break, a pause between who I'd been and whoever I was supposed to be next. But the truth was, I didn't trust myself to stay in the life I had built around their lies. I needed to breathe where no one knew my name. It was a small coastal town 3 hours away that finally made me stop driving. The kind of place where the houses had porches and the coffee shops still used chalkboard menus. The ocean was gray and wind-raked, nothing like the beaches in postcards, but it was honest. Brutally honest. The kind of landscape that didn't pretend to be gentle. I found a motel with peeling paint and paper-thin walls. The woman at the front desk wore a sweatshirt that read "Ask me if I care" in faded letters. She didn't ask questions. Just slid me a key and told me where to park. The room smelled like mildew and old soap, but the bed was clean and the window faced the water. That night, I sat on the floor with a grocery store sandwich and listened to the waves thrash against the shore like something was trying to break out of them. I stayed there for 3 days. The second morning, I wandered into a bookstore cafe tucked between a bait shop and a laundromat. The shelves were old and overstuffed, their spines worn like bruises. I ordered coffee and took it to a corner seat, burying myself in a book I didn't have the energy to follow. That's when she spoke. You look like someone who's survived a war, the woman said from the table beside mine. She was in her 70s, maybe older, wearing too much blush and a scarf that looked like it had stories. Her voice was low and matter-of-fact, the kind people used when they weren't asking for permission. I hope you won, she added, sipping her tea. I didn't know what to say. I smiled faintly, a reflex more than anything. She didn't press. Just went back to her crossword puzzle like nothing had happened. But the word stayed with me. Not the war part. The hope. That night, I sat on the motel bed and made a list. Not a to-do list or a list of reasons why he and my sister didn't deserve forgiveness. Just a list of things I still wanted: to laugh without flinching, to sleep without dreaming, to sit at a dinner table and not scan for betrayal. The next morning, I helped an old man pick up a box of oranges he dropped outside the market. He told me he was making marmalade and offered me a jar. I said yes. It was too sweet, the texture uneven, but I ate it by the spoonful that night in the motel room, because it was made by someone who didn't expect anything in return. There was kindness in the cracks of those days. Strangers who held doors, smiled with their whole faces, complimented my scarf. No one asked what I did for a living, or if I was married. No one looked at me like I was a half-formed story they were trying to guess the ending of. They just saw a woman passing through, and that was enough. On my last morning there, I walked barefoot along the beach. The sand was cold, clinging to my toes like regret. I stood at the edge of the surf and let the water nip at my ankles, thinking about all the things I'd been afraid to say out loud. How I didn't just lose a husband and a sister. I lost the idea that love could be safe. But maybe it wasn't supposed to be. Maybe love wasn't a fortress. Maybe it was a weather dock you built piece by piece, knowing full well the tide would rise. I didn't find clarity on that beach, or peace, or any of the cliches people chase when they run away. But I found quiet. The kind that lives in your ribs and hums softly under your skin. The kind that says, "You are not what they did to you." That was enough to make me go home. It was dusk when I pulled into the driveway. The porch light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay on, and the lawn was scattered with brittle leaves that had gathered during my absence, piling up like unattended grief. The key stuck in the lock for a moment before giving way, and when the door creaked open, the smell of old coffee and dust greeted me like an old enemy. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. The sofa with its sagging cushions. The bookshelf we built together, still leaning slightly to one side. The hallway mirror, still bearing the faint streaks of a hurried goodbye. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, just empty. I stood in the entryway longer than necessary, afraid to cross the threshold of a life I no longer belonged to. But eventually I stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind me. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the house by memory, hand brushing the edge of the console table, feet avoiding the creaky board in the hallway. I opened the bedroom door and stared at the unmade bed, the sheets tangled in a way that made it impossible to remember which side had been mine. I sat on the floor. Not the bed. Not the chair. The floor. Because it felt like the only place low enough to match the way my body carried itself now. I leaned my head back against the wall and exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The silence pressed in around me, thick and unmoving. Grief lives in walls. I believe that now. You can scrub the floors and repaint the trim, but some betrayals sink in too deep. They cling to the corners, to the baseboards, to the way the light hits the room, just so at 4 p.m. They hum in the air vents and seep into the wood. The house remembered everything. I spent the next few days packing. Not everything. Just the pieces of me that still felt like mine. Books I hadn't shared with him. Sweaters that didn't smell like his cologne. A framed photo from a solo trip I'd taken years before we met, where I stood barefoot in the rain in Barcelona, laughing at nothing. That woman had felt so far away for so long. I wasn't sure I could find her again, but I packed her photo anyway. The closet was the hardest. His shirts were gone, mostly, but a tie lingered draped over the edge of a drawer. I stared at it for a long time, then dropped it into the donation bag with a weightless kind of anger. It didn't deserve a dramatic ending. It just didn't deserve to stay. I found the letter while clearing out the nightstand. Folded once, sealed with a red sticker shaped like a heart, one of those novelty things we used to think were cute. It was dated 5 years ago, marked "To the me I hope you're becoming." I remembered writing it during a self-help workshop I attended alone, back when I still believed self-improvement was a form of salvation. I opened it. It was clumsy and hopeful, filled with phrases like, "I hope you're still brave," and "Don't lose your softness just because the world doesn't know what to do with it." I didn't cry reading it. I envied the version of myself who had written it. She still believed growth was a straight line. But somewhere near the end, she'd scribbled a question I'd forgotten asking. If you had to choose between being loved and being safe, what would you pick? I folded the letter back up and tucked it in my wallet. That night, I sat in the empty living room with a single lamp on and called a moving company. I didn't know where I was going yet, not exactly. But it wouldn't be here. I couldn't stay in a place where every sound reminded me of who I used to be when I believed people didn't lie with their whole bodies. Before bed, I walked the house one last time. I said goodbye to the hallway where we danced once, drunk and barefoot. Goodbye to the kitchen where he told me he wanted kids and later where he said he needed space. Goodbye to the bathroom mirror that watched me rehearse forgiveness over and over again without ever saying a word. And when I turned off the final light, I didn't feel empty. I felt ready. There wasn't a single moment when I knew I was free. No triumphant sunrise or symbolic haircut, or Instagram-worthy quote taped to my bathroom mirror. Just a series of quiet, almost imperceptible shifts. Like the first time I laughed without flinching. The first night I fell asleep without checking my phone. The way I stopped writing drafts of messages I'd never send. I moved into a small apartment with creaky floors and sun-dappled windows. It was nothing like the house. No porch swing, no walk-in closet, no memories carved into the baseboards. But it was mine.
Entire la imine.
The key turned cleanly in the lock. The walls were bare. A blank page. On my second night there, I stood in front of the mirror in my new bathroom. No fog on the glass, no memories layered in steam. Just my reflection, tired and honest. I touched the scar on my ankle where I'd stepped on the wine glass. It had healed awkwardly, pink and raised like a warning. But it didn't hurt anymore. That scar had become a kind of punctuation mark. The kind that ends one sentence so a new one can begin. I started walking in the mornings again, something I hadn't done in years. Not for fitness. For rhythm. For the reminder that moving forward was still possible. Even when it felt aimless. I passed the same old man every day, sitting on a bench feeding birds. One morning, he looked up, squinted into the light, and said, "You're starting to look like someone who believes the worst part is over." I didn't know how to respond, but I smiled, and he nodded like that was enough. I told a new friend the story one night. Someone who hadn't known me before, who didn't carry any version of me in their head, but the one I offered. I didn't dress it up. I didn't soften the edges. I told it plainly, and when I was done they didn't say, "That's terrible," or "You didn't deserve that." They said, "And you're still standing." That's the part that matters. Still standing. Not triumphant. Not unscathed. But upright. I didn't forgive my sister. I didn't forgive him. And I didn't rush myself into pretending that I would one day. Maybe forgiveness was for people who had been broken open gently, not gutted like fish and left to stink in the sun. I carried my anger carefully now, not like a weapon but like a lantern. It lit up the parts of me I used to hide, my boundaries, my voice, the way I now said no without apology. And my parents, I let them stay gone. I didn't return their messages. I didn't send updates. I didn't owe them access to the version of me that came after the damage. They had chosen their comfort over my truth. I chose peace over proximity. Sometimes I imagine what I'd say if I saw them again. You taught me to keep the peace but never to question who it was meant to protect. You taught me to be quiet so you wouldn't feel bad. I'm not quiet anymore. Some nights I still woke up afraid, heart racing, fingers clenched, body braced for betrayal. Trauma doesn't exit politely. It lingers, presses its fingerprints into your nervous system. But I learned how to breathe through it. To name it when it came. You are a memory. You are not the present. I started writing again. Not for work. For me. Pages full of fragments, things I remembered, things I wished I'd said, things I was still afraid of. Slowly, the fragments began to form stories. I didn't write about them, not directly. I wrote about women who got out. Women who didn't need to be rescued because they finally stopped waiting for permission to save themselves. The last line I wrote that month was this. I am not what they did. I am what I chose after. There's a kind of grace that comes from surviving yourself. From sitting with every broken part and saying, I'll carry you until you're ready to walk. I stood in front of the mirror again last week. Just stood there. No makeup. No armor. I said my name out loud. The sound didn't tremble. It didn't need to, because it belonged to someone who had walked through fire and come out scarred but still hers. Still whole. Still here. If this story echoed something inside you, if you've ever been asked to stay silent when your soul screamed for justice, Know this. You're not alone and you're not powerless. Your truth matters. Your voice matters. And you deserve a life built on your own terms, not the wreckage others left behind. Share this story. Speak your truth. Walk away when silence asks too much. Because survival isn't the end. It's the beginning. See you soon in the next one.